What's going on, everyone? Tanner here, and in this video I'm going to set up a Blackwater aquarium just for my Betta. Let's get started. For this setup I'm going to use a 5-gallon Fluval spec that I found in the trash. Yes, you heard that right, I found this in the trash. What up, fellow cheapskates? You know how I get down. I drive past the house last week and I see these aquariums sitting out in their trash. I take them for myself because with a little hard work we get them looking brand new. Not to mention that we got this awesome bikini bottom scape down in the Fluval spec. Along with the whole gang, we got SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, and Gary. He's dead. It needed cleaned up a little bit, but everything was in really good shape, including the pump. Not sure why somebody would have went and thrown this out, but one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? That said, the only thing that wasn't salvageable was the light. I also added new filter media, but we'll touch on that later on in the video. Anyways, like we usually do, let's start out with the hardscape. What I have here are 2 pieces of Malaysian driftwood that will be combined into one. I planned out how these would fit together ahead of time, so at this point it was just a matter of seeing how they fit in the aquarium. Once I determined they would fit well, I took them out of the aquarium and set them up as before, using a stone to keep them propped up. Here you can get a better look at how well these pieces actually do fit together. I didn't modify them in any way, I just used their natural features to my advantage. Since they already fit together like a puzzle, all that I had to do was glue them together with some super glue. First I dabbed a little bit of glue on the appropriate spots. Then I pressed the pieces together and applied pressure for roughly a minute. Afterward I let the glue dry for 15 minutes or so before removing the stone that was holding everything up. From there I put down a small slab of marble, which will be used to hold up the driftwood. As you'll notice, the driftwood is pretty top heavy in its current state. That's why I had it propped up initially, and the same reason that I'm going to use this marble. What I did was simply put a little bit of super glue on the wood. Then it was pressed onto the marble and held in place until everything was stuck together. Once the glue is fully dried, I put it into the aquarium. Before we move on, I'm not sure if you noticed it or not, but how much does this formation look like a dragon? Here's a picture that I posted of it on Instagram to give you a better look. Initially, I didn't even notice it until a lot of you started commenting about it, then I couldn't unsee it. Pretty interesting, right? Now I'll show you some of the largest plants that we'll be using, which are a few Kleiner bar swords. These plants had a lot of dead sections and other bits that weren't going to last once planted, so I trimmed them up before use. Unfortunately, most of the taller growth will end up dying later on due to acclimation, but I'll keep what I can for now to give the plants a better start. And here they are after a good trim, all cleaned up and ready for action. Since these plants are so large, I wanted to get a better idea of how I was going to plant them prior to adding the substrate. So I placed them in the aquarium and moved them around for a little bit until I got them in a location that I thought looked aesthetically pleasing. I think these plants are a great choice because they will grow upwards of 18 inches tall, and I really want to capitalize on the riparian aspect of this scape since the aquarium is rimless. Now we'll add the substrate. For this tank I'm going to use some Fluval Stratum planted tank substrate. I'm using this because it's what I already had laying around my house, but something beneficial about it is that it's going to help lower the pH, which is great for bettas. Anyways, I started by dumping a bit of substrate into the tank. Then I used a brush to work it into position. As I worked through this, I added more when necessary so that I could get a nice slope up toward the left side and an adequate depth overall. Once I had the substrate just right, I proceeded to plant the swords. To do so, I moved the substrate to the side and dropped the plant into the opening. Like before, I used the brush to bury the roots underneath of the substrate. The same process was then repeated for the other sword. Next we'll add some flame moss. I very well could have glued these patches in place, but I didn't feel like dealing with that in this build. So I simply lodged the moss in crevices and other strategic locations on the driftwood. Long term, I want the log to be covered primarily by a lush sweater of moss. I also want some growing above the waterline as well. As I tend to think with most of my setups, I believe that the moss will really make things look interesting, and I think the Betta will also appreciate it too. Once I finished placing all of the moss, I proceeded to fill up the aquarium with some dechlorinated water. I did so by pouring it into the filter compartment so that it didn't disturb the substrate. Luckily the water stayed fairly clear, so I could proceed to plant the rest of the setup right away. Down on the right, I added a few Cryptocorn Wenti bronze. These will get to a decent size and really fill in the space given enough time to grow. You'll notice that as I'm planting the crypts, it's tough to get them rooted just right. This is one of my complaints with Fluvalstratum. It's initially pretty light, which makes it challenging to plant a new aquarium. To combat this, I could have capped it off or mixed in a different substrate to make it more dense. Next, I planted a few Cryptocorn lutea on the left side of this setup. These will also help fill in the space and provide nice texture because of the narrow leaves. Lastly, I planted a few segments of Java fern behind the driftwood. As I said earlier, my intent is for this to be a Blackwater setup, so let's go ahead and prepare all of the botanicals. I started by boiling some small catappa leaves so that they would sink and to remove some of the tannins. Afterward, I dropped them into the aquarium and moved them around with my tweezers when necessary. Then I got a bin full of miscellaneous botanicals that have been soaking for a few weeks. I definitely didn't need to soak them for that amount of time, but it took me longer than expected to get this setup going. Anyways, I went ahead and added these all throughout the aquarium and let everything cycle for about a month. After that amount of time, my Betta could finally be added into the aquarium. The water parameters from tank to tank were pretty consistent, so it could be added directly into the new setup without any acclimation. So here's my Betta's new Blackwater aquarium. I should add the disclaimer that the water is not nearly as tinted as I originally intended, but it still incorporates the elements indicative of a Blackwater setup. That said, I probably will try to tint the water more as time goes on, because this tank does need some fine tuning. I know some of you may be wondering why I planted it so sparsely. Well, that was on purpose because of the plants that I chose. Allow me to explain. Here's what the tank looks like now, but let me do a quick sketch of how it will look in a few months. As you can see from the sketch, the Betta will still have some good swimming space, plenty of places to rest, and an overall enriching environment. Normally I don't even bother sketching out my designs because I have them sketched out in my mind, but sometimes it does help to make a visual representation of an idea. Hopefully this also gives you a better idea of my long-term vision for this aquarium. I know I'll get comments about adding other inhabitants to this setup, but I'm going to be upfront with you and say that I'm not putting anything else in this tank other than a cleanup crew. I already have some Malaysian trumpet snails, but I also want to add a few nerite snails and some Amano shrimp. Otherwise, I want this to be low maintenance, and having a low stock will help do exactly that for a number of reasons. Plus, I want the Betta to be the star of this tank. As I said in the beginning, I had to buy new filter media, which consists of a sponge and some ceramic rings. I'm also using the original pump because it was in good shape. However, I did have to put a chunk of sponge on the output of the pump to reduce the flow. I'm still fine tuning it, but I want it to be strong enough to keep the water moving, but gentle enough that the Betta can still swim around freely. Lastly, I'm keeping my heater in the back compartment of the filter box. I really like how it turned out, and I can't wait to see how it changes with time. I think my Betta likes it more than me though. I can tell just by the way that he interacts with his environment that he's content. That's always a good feeling, and what this is all about. Anyways, I'm going to end it there. If you want to see the progression of this aquarium and similar projects like this in the future, then consider subscribing if you're not already. Also, if you like this project and haven't done so already, please take a second and give this video a like. It really does help me out, and I'd greatly appreciate it. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Peace.